The lawyer slowly placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the polished mahogany table. The room fell silent. Everyone's eyes followed the envelope. Mine did too. Until that moment, my stepmother, Margaret, had been smiling. Not the smile of a grieving widow. It was the smile of someone who believed she had finally won. Only minutes earlier, the lawyer had finished reading most of my father, Robert Bennett's will. His expensive watches, Margaret. His jewelry, Margaret. His personal belongings, Margaret. The SUV she had driven for years, Margaret. Every sentence seemed to make her smile a little wider. Then the lawyer turned another page. He adjusted his glasses before speaking again. To my daughter, Amara Bennett. My heart skipped. For the first time since the reading had begun, I lifted my head. My name, finally. For one brief second, I believed my father had left me something. Maybe a letter. Maybe a memory. Maybe an explanation. The lawyer continued. I leave my love and my hope that one day she finds peace. That was it. Nothing else. No family home, no savings, no business. No explanation. Just one sentence. Margaret slowly folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. The tiny smile on her face said everything. She had won. I lowered my eyes to the floor. I wasn't crying because I had received nothing. I was crying because I couldn't stop wondering, had my father really believed the lies? Did he honestly think I had abandoned him? Did he spend his final days believing his own daughter no longer cared? That thought hurt far more than losing any inheritance ever could. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood at the back of my father's funeral, not because I wanted to, because I had no other choice. As I walked into the church, conversation slowly faded. Margaret looked up from the front row. She watched me for a moment before letting out a quiet sigh. Then, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, she said, now she decides to come. Several heads turned toward me. Margaret slowly shook her head. Robert asked for her almost every day. She paused just long enough for everyone to listen, but she was always too busy. A few relatives looked at me with disappointment. Others quietly looked away. My father's oldest friend lowered his eyes. My own aunt silently moved her handbag onto the empty seat beside her before I had a chance to sit down. No one said a word. They didn't have to. I understood exactly what they believed. In their eyes, I was the daughter who abandoned Robert Bennett while he was dying. I quietly walked to the back of the church. I stood through the entire service, alone. When people lined up afterward, they hugged Margaret. They held her hands. They told her how devoted she had been. Not one person came to me, not one. I buried my father, believing he had died, thinking I no longer loved him. That pain never left me. Now, 3 weeks later, I sat in the same silence, listening to the final chapter of his life. The lawyer adjusted his glasses once more. Before we conclude today's reading, he said calmly, there is one final instruction left by Mr. Bennett. Margaret frowned. What instruction? The lawyer looked down at the envelope. He instructed me to open this only after the will had been read in full. Margaret laughed softly. Another one of Robert's dramatic surprises? She said with a smile. Probably another sentimental letter. The lawyer didn't respond. He carefully broke the wax seal, removed several neatly folded pages. His eyes scanned the first paragraph. Then, he stopped. His expression changed completely. The room suddenly felt heavier. He slowly raised his eyes. First, he looked at Margaret. Then, he looked at me. When he spoke again, his voice was noticeably quieter. Mrs. Bennett, I believe you're going to want to hear every word of this. For the first time that morning, Margaret stopped smiling. I had no idea that the next few minutes would destroy everything she believed she had won, or that my father had spent the final months of his life quietly preparing for this exact moment. But to understand why, you have to go back 3 months. Back to the day everything began to fall apart. 3 months earlier, my father was still alive. At 72, Robert Bennett was the kind of man who refused to admit he was getting older. Every morning, he woke before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat on the back porch watching the birds arrive before the rest of the neighborhood was awake. He said it reminded him that every day was another chance to begin again. After my mother passed away, it had been just the two of us for years. We weren't wealthy back then, far from it. Dad worked long hours building the business that would eventually give us a comfortable life. Some nights he'd come home exhausted, his hands stained with grease and dust, but he'd still find the energy to ask about my day. Every Sunday became our tradition. No matter how busy life became, Sunday breakfast belonged to us. Even after I got married and moved across town, he'd still call every Saturday evening. 8 o'clock tomorrow, he'd say. And don't let me eat those pancakes alone. I'd always laugh. I wouldn't dare. Those breakfasts became some of my happiest memories. Then Margaret entered our lives. When Dad introduced us, she seemed kind. She smiled often. She complimented my cooking. She brought flowers whenever she visited. When they married 2 years later, I genuinely believed Dad had found happiness again. I wanted that for him. I truly did. For the first few months, nothing seemed different. Then little things began to change. Sunday breakfast became once a month, then once every few months. Eventually, they stopped completely. Whenever I called, Margaret answered. He's sleeping. I just gave him his medication. He's resting. I'll tell him you called. She always sounded polite, never rude, never angry. Just impossible to argue with. Every excuse sounded reasonable. So I believed her. Then one afternoon, everything changed. An old employee from Dad's company called me. Amara. His voice sounded nervous. I thought you knew. Knew what? Your father was admitted to the hospital yesterday. I nearly dropped my phone. Margaret hadn't called, not once. I left work immediately. I bought Dad's favorite meat pie from the little bakery he'd loved for years. Then I stopped at the florist and picked up fresh white lilies. He always said lilies reminded him of my mother. By the time I reached the hospital, visiting hours had just begun. I smiled at the receptionist. I'm here to see Robert Bennett. She typed his name into the computer, then her smile disappeared. I'm sorry. She looked back at the screen. Mr. Bennett has requested no visitors. For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard her wrong. My father? She nodded gently. I'm very sorry. I stood there frozen. He must not know I'm here. I'm afraid these are his instructions. I looked down at the flowers in my hands. The meat pie was still warm. I wanted to argue, to insist, to run past the desk if I had to. Instead, I quietly thanked her, walked outside, and sat on a bench in the parking lot until the flowers began to wilt. I cried all the way home. I kept asking myself the same question. What had I done? The next morning, I called again. No answer. The day after that, nothing. By the end of the month, I'd called more than 40 times. Every call went unanswered. So I started writing letters every Sunday evening, without fail. I wrote about work, about the grandchildren, about the garden he loved, about the little things that used to make him laugh. Every letter ended the same way. I love you, Dad. I'll keep trying until I see you again. I believed he was reading every single one. I couldn't have been more wrong. One rainy Tuesday evening, Margaret carried the unopened letters into the backyard. She placed an old metal bucket on the ground. One by one, she opened each envelope. She read the first few lines, rolled her eyes, then dropped the letters into the fire. The flames swallowed every word I'd written, every apology, every memory, every I love you. Within minutes, weeks of hope had become nothing more than ashes blowing across the yard. Inside the house, my father sat quietly by the living room window, looking toward the front gate, waiting for a letter that would never arrive, waiting for me. The weeks passed. Dad's condition slowly grew worse. Simple things became difficult. Walking from the bedroom to the kitchen left him exhausted. Some afternoons, he would sit quietly by the living room window for hours, watching the neighborhood outside. Yet every time I called to ask how he was doing, Margaret's answer never changed. He's resting. The doctor doesn't want him stressed. He's sleeping. He can't have visitors today. She always sounded kind, patient, concerned. Never once did she raise her voice. Never once did she sound angry. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed she was the perfect wife. So I kept waiting, and I kept writing. Every Sunday evening, without fail. I wrote another letter. I told Dad about work, about the grandchildren he adored, about my garden, about the funny little things I knew would make him smile. Every letter ended exactly the same. I love you, Dad. I'll keep trying until I see you again. I believed he was reading every single one. I couldn't have been more wrong. One afternoon, Dad looked toward the small table beside his chair. Margaret. She looked up from the kitchen. Yes? Could you bring me my phone? She smiled. Of course. She handed it to him. He stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly sighing. I can't remember Amara's number. Everything was saved in his contacts. He hadn't memorized a phone number in years. Margaret gently took the phone from his hands. I'll call her for you. She walked into the hallway. Dad could hear her tapping the screen. A few moments later, she returned. She handed him the phone. No answer. Dad forced a small smile. She must be busy. Margaret rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. I'm sure she'll call when she has time. He nodded. I suppose. A few days later, it happened again. Could you call Amara for me? Margaret smiled. Of course. She disappeared into the hallway. Less than a minute later, she returned. Straight to voicemail. Dad looked disappointed. Maybe she's working. I'm sure that's all it is. Margaret replied softly. Over the next several weeks, the same conversation repeated itself again and again. Whenever Dad asked about me, Margaret always had an answer. She didn't answer. She hasn't called. She's probably busy. Little by little, Dad stopped asking as often. Not because he stopped loving me, but because he slowly convinced himself. Maybe I really had moved on with my life. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Mrs. Harris arrived to clean the house. She had worked for our family for nearly 20 years. She remembered my mother. She remembered me growing up. More importantly, she loved my father too much to lie to him. While Margaret went grocery shopping, Mrs. Harris helped Dad onto the back patio. The fresh air seemed to lift his spirits. For a while, they simply sat together in silence. Then Dad smiled. Have you seen Amara lately? Mrs. Harris smiled back. I've seen her several times. Dad nodded. I knew she'd eventually come. Her smile slowly faded. Eventually? She looked confused. Mr. Bennett? She comes almost every week. Dad frowned. What do you mean? Mrs. Harris hesitated. I've seen her bring flowers and food and letters. Sometimes she just sits in her car outside the gate hoping someone will let her in. Dad stared at her. His expression slowly changed. She's been here? Mrs. Harris nodded. Almost every week. The color drained from his face. Margaret told me, his voice cracked, that Amara stopped coming months ago. Mrs. Harris looked genuinely confused. No, sir. She never stopped. Not once. Silence. Dad looked toward the front gate, his eyes filled with tears. Then another thought crossed his mind. The letters. Mrs. Harris frowned. What letters? The ones she wrote. I never received a single one. Mrs. Harris slowly shook her head. I watched her leave envelopes in the mailbox. Every Sunday. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in months, Dad realized something was terribly wrong. Not because someone had accused Margaret. Not because he had caught her lying. But because the pieces no longer fit together. The unanswered phone calls, the missing letters, The canceled visits, the stories, the excuses. None of it made sense anymore. The following morning, Dad made another request. Margaret, she looked up from the breakfast table. Could you call my lawyer? She smiled. Is everything all right? He returned a gentle smile of his own. I just want to put a few things in order. She nodded without hesitation. I'll arrange it. That afternoon, his lawyer arrived. The two men spent nearly 3 hours together behind the closed door of Dad's study. No one else was invited inside, not even Margaret. When the lawyer finally left, Margaret walked into the study. What did you two spend all afternoon talking about? Dad smiled. Oh, just making sure everything is taken care of. She smiled back, satisfied. She never asked another question, and Dad never offered another answer. Neither of them realized. They had just set in motion the events that would change everything after his death. Neither of us knew it then, but that conversation with his lawyer would become my father's final act of love. 2 weeks later, Robert Bennett was gone. I buried him believing he had died, thinking I abandoned him. 3 weeks after the funeral, I found myself sitting in his lawyer's office, listening to the reading of his will, and staring at the sealed envelope resting on the table. No one in the room spoke. The silence felt heavier than it had all morning. Margaret sat back in her chair, her arms folded confidently. The reading of the will was over. She believed she had won. I sat across from her, staring at the sealed envelope resting on the table. After everything I had lost, after the funeral, after weeks of believing my father died, thinking I had abandoned him, I wasn't expecting that envelope to change anything. I couldn't have been more wrong. The lawyer reached for it. Without saying a word, he carefully broke the wax seal. He unfolded the first page and glanced down. Then he looked up. This letter, he said quietly, was written in Mr. Robert Bennett's own hand. He took a slow breath. Then he began to read. To my wife, Margaret, and to my daughter, Amara. If you're listening to this letter, then my time has come to an end. First, I want to thank you both for being part of my life. Margaret smiled again. She folded her hands confidently. The lawyer continued. Margaret, you stood beside me during some of the most difficult years of my life. For that, I will always be grateful. Margaret looked around the room as if the letter had already proven her right. Then the lawyer read the next paragraph. Amara, if there's one thing I pray you never doubt, it's that I have loved you every single day of your life. My heart stopped. The room disappeared around me. For weeks, I had lived with the unbearable thought that my father believed I had abandoned him. Now, for the first time, I knew he hadn't. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized I was crying. The lawyer continued. For many months, I was told you had stopped calling, that you no longer visited, that you had chosen to move on with your life. He looked up briefly before continuing. I wanted to believe it, because accepting anything else would have meant accepting that someone I trusted was lying to me. Margaret shifted in her chair. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Then one afternoon, I learned the truth. The lawyer stopped. He turned the page. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. I learned that my daughter never stopped trying to reach me. She came to see me. She wrote letters. She called. She waited outside my home. Every act of love was hidden from me. I covered my mouth with both hands. Margaret's face had gone completely pale. The lawyer continued. The greatest heartbreak of my life was believing my daughter had forgotten me. The greatest relief of my life was discovering she never had. A tear rolled down my cheek. I wasn't thinking about the inheritance anymore. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about my father. He knew. He had known before he died. The lawyer lowered the letter. There is one final instruction. He reached into the envelope. This time, he removed a thick folder. Several legal documents were clipped neatly together. Margaret leaned forward. What is that? The lawyer looked directly at her. These documents were signed 6 months before Mr. Bennett's passing. He opened the folder. Mr. Bennett created the Bennett Family Trust. Margaret frowned. What does that mean? The lawyer calmly continued. It means that the family home, the commercial properties, the investment accounts, his business interests, and every income-producing asset were legally transferred into the trust while Mr. Bennett was still alive. Margaret blinked. I'm his wife. The lawyer nodded. Yes, so they belong to me. The lawyer slowly closed the folder. No, Mrs. Bennett. They never formed part of the estate. The room fell silent. According to the trust documents, the sole beneficiary is Amara Bennett. Margaret shot to her feet. No, that's impossible. He wouldn't do that. The lawyer remained calm. He already did. The documents were properly executed. They cannot be altered. Margaret turned toward me. You knew about this. I slowly shook my head. I didn't even know the trust existed. She looked back at the lawyer. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. The lawyer picked up the final page of Robert's letter. There's one last paragraph. He began reading. Margaret, I have left you everything that belonged to you. The car you've driven for years, the personal belongings we shared, the memories we created together. I hope they bring you comfort, but everything I spent my lifetime building belongs to the child who loved me before I had any of it. The lawyer looked up. Then he read the final lines. Amara, I couldn't protect our relationship while I was alive. I hope these final decisions show you what I never stopped feeling. You were, and always will be, the greatest blessing of my life. The lawyer quietly folded the letter. No one spoke. Margaret slowly sat back down. She stared at the table. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. As for me, I wasn't thinking about the businesses, or the house, or the investments. I was holding the last letter my father ever wrote. For weeks, I believed he had died thinking I abandoned him. Instead, he had spent his final months making sure the truth would one day find me. I walked out of the lawyer's office, carrying nothing in my hands except that letter. Yet somehow, I felt like I had just been given my father back.